I learned from my Father, I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last. Then the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. This is my command: love one another. Thanks be to God for his word.
Greater love than this has no man, that a man will lay down his life for his friend. If you are able, let's sing our next hymn.
So we're going to think about this psalm, and let me get this gadget working. Reminds me of a bishop who was fumbling with the PA system in the church, in the cathedral perhaps, and muttered to himself, "There's something wrong with this." And the congregation responded, "Also with you." Well, we wait and see. My microphone has gone. My microphone has gone. Is that okay? Thank you. Now we're there. And I'd hope that we could have these on bit by bit, and I think actually we've managed to go to 2. So let's go back to 1. That's it. It's a season for holidays, isn't it? And I guessed if I went round with a microphone, you'd all have your own little memories of holidays, things that you will never, ever forget. We were very fortunate as a family, because we used to go for many, many years to one of the Baptist Holiday Fellowship centres. I used to do a few jobs like do the prayers and arrange the excursions. And of course, my wife and the kids, they really had a great time. But there was one occasion I will never, ever forget. A couple arrived, 2 ladies, I think it was a lady and her companion, arrived. And almost from the moment they stepped over the doorstep, there were issues. The management got far more than I did, I have to say. But they did have a couple of goes at me until Tuesday came and we went out in a coach for an excursion. After lunch, the coach driver started playing music over his PA system. Wasn't long before a note came to me, "Will you ask the driver to stop the music and switch it off?" Well, I didn't particularly want to have any issues with the driver. But mercifully, we were stopping a little later on for tea, and I thought, now's my chance. So I went and had a word with him, and I got a very blunt reply. "It's my coach. I do what I like." So, having resumed the journey, I thought I'd better go back to these 2 ladies who'd sent the note. I know who it was. And said, "Well, I'm very sorry. I had a word with the driver, but it didn't cooperate." "Oh, no, we like it." Why? Because in the meantime, he'd started playing gospel music. Now, they made an indelible impression upon me, an indelible impression. And one day, it must have been 4 years later, I saw them in the front pew in church. And all during the service, I thought, wow. They organized it so as to be the last person coming out, the last people coming out. You'll never guess what they said when they shook hands with me. "You won't remember us." It was much as I could do to say, "I will never, ever forget you. Never in all my days." Well, I expect you have stories. It's me not doing this thing properly. So holidays are great, aren't they? They provide all kinds of things. It's time for pleasure. It's time to relax. It's time to do all those kind of things. Although I think relaxing means different things to different people. I heard of somebody who came back from holiday the other week, fortnight's holiday in Egypt, and the best he could say about it was a holiday with his wife, the 2 of them on their own. Not an angry word in the whole fortnight. Wow, that must say something about what life's like normally, mustn't it? And to think the best thing you could say that there was no angry word. Each to their own. I heard of a very stern, very rigid Christian about whom it was said that he was the very epitome of duty. And in a little comment in a biography about him, he said he never permitted himself a pleasure. Well, I have to say I permit myself lots of pleasures and have as much fun as you can, because I think that's it. And of course, it's a time to escape. A lady told me of her brother, who when holidays came, he took his watch off and put it on one side and didn't pick it up until he came back from his holiday and resumed work on the Monday morning. It's a time to escape and to relax and to get away and to be... And in all seriousness, I think sometimes to renew relationships with people who are very close to you. It isn't that you've fallen out of love during the hurly-burly of life, but it's a time to be together and to renew that and to refurbish it. It's all those kind of things. A time for laughter and for song. People wonder where I get all my jokes from. Well, a lot of them came through the people I met on holiday, and I managed to remember one or two. There's a time for all that. But the people in this psalm, about whom it is said that they were singing, about whom it was said that they sang, "The Lord has done great things," but they weren't on holiday. They weren't people going away, although there may just have been. So we ask, why were they full of laughter and song? Why was a smile on their hearts? Why were they reveling enough? Well, because they were people who had been delivered. We're not really sure about which deliverance, and when you read through the Old Testament, it's a kind of saga of deliverance, isn't it? You start off with Moses going to the children of Israel in captivity in Egypt. I wonder if he did what politicians do today. We're going to leave and announce the date. I wonder if he got caught up in political negotiations. But I have to say, Pharaoh changed his mind a fair number of times, and I guess people must have wondered whether they would actually get out. I wonder about October 31st. Anyhow, that's another story, isn't it, you see? There were people who had been delivered. I can go back to those years when the armies, the Allied armies, went through Europe, went through France and Belgium and Holland, and time again there were people out on the streets with flowers. They discovered flags, national flags they'd hidden away that they hung up. Bottles of wine were being given out to the troops. They were people who'd been delivered, they'd been set free, they'd been liberated. Quite early on, as the children of Israel traveled, they came to the Red Sea. And we're told that there, as they fronted the Red Sea, they stood still. And then a few verses on, it says that they saw the deliverance of the Lord. Boy, oh boy, did they see it. But when you read the Old Testament, that wasn't the only deliverance. The deliverance from Sennacherib's army. That was about 700 years before Jesus came, during the reign of Hezekiah the king. The army came and it surrounded Jerusalem, and the numbers were in such were so high, so great, that they thought there's no hope for us. And then there was prayer, and next morning the army had gone. They were delivered. It wasn't their military action that did it. It wasn't their strategy. It wasn't that they had greater forces in the army. It was God who intervened, the Lord who came in and delivered them. And so we could go on. A little group of people who'd been held captive in Babylon, returning to Jerusalem. There weren't many of them, I have to say. That again, about 300 years or so before Jesus came. And what is the curious thing when you read that story is that the scripture says quite clearly that the Lord set the heart of the pagan ruler, Cyrus, to allow them to do that. God was in it. God was delivering them. Now, you and I can look back not just on those deliverances, and remember they're historical. They're not some fictitious kind of thing that you find in some kind of religious annals and scripts. They were historical events. But you and I have a vantage point, and we can look back on a greater deliverance. We can look back on... It'll come. And we can look back on that deliverance that Jesus brought for us. We can look back on the gospel story. And what did the Gospels do? What did Jesus achieve when he died on the cross? What did he bring about? He brought about the ending of our separation from God, our isolation, if you will, our exile in a land of sin and evil and wrongdoing. He dealt with that. He delivered us from the power of sin. 3 letters in the word sin. So simple. But I tell you, its power and its grip and its hold upon people when they've lived a life and got into habits and practices and attitudes, that grip on their life is strong. It is as strong as an iron clamp. It's a prison. And Jesus comes to set us free from that. If you look down the history of the church, you hear stories again and again and again of men and women who've been set free from Jesus, been liberated, been given a new life, and taken to a new place, discovered new potential for their living, taken them on. And it is also freedom from death, liberation from death, because death is the consequence of our wrongdoing. And if that is dealt with, if a sin is dealt with, then the consequence of that sin are dealt with. We are delivered from death. We're delivered from sadness and despair. You know, I go down to the Arndale or I go into any shopping centre and I look at people's faces, and so many of them look as if they've got the cares of the world on their shoulders. They look depressed. They look as if life is difficult for them. They've got anxious furrows there. And so, now, I know I don't have a very happy face when I'm relaxing. I know that. And the Lord made us in different kinds of ways. But I'm saying to you that people's faces so often give it away. And they're living in this sadness, in this despair. There's a kind of from one day to another and just making... And all that, what should it evoke? It should evoke joy. It should evoke laughter. It should evoke song. It should evoke praise. It should set our hearts on fire with delight and our tongues filled with songs of joy. It's many, many years since I became a Christian, almost back in antiquity. But I can still remember that night when I knelt by my bed. I can still remember crying, and they weren't really tears of sadness. They were tears, well, they're tears of amazement that Jesus should call me and want me. And strangely enough, in all the tears, there was a deep and profound joy. Now, I tell you this, that the joy of the believer when he becomes a Christian is exceeded only by the joy of heaven above when they see this happen, by the joy of angels and all the hosts above saying, "There's another one, Lord, there's another one." And I think you and I pick up some of that joy. I think some of you and I capture it and have it in our hearts. And folks, this isn't the question of your personality and the way you're made. I may express it one way and you may express it another way. But the joy that Jesus gives isn't limited to people with a certain personality. It isn't just the extroverts and the demonstrative. It's there for everyone. It's there for you as well. Now, that's all pretty straightforward from what we see. But suddenly, the psalm changes. And from all the laughter and song of that first part, it all changes. And it gives way. Well, in a way, that's like life, isn't it? Holidays come to an end. I regret to tell you that summer won't last forever, even if we do wish it would go on till 25th of December. You know, summer gives place to autumn, and autumn gives place to winter. And the days of rest and relaxation on holiday, when we're so conscious of God's love and God's goodness, change. And Monday morning dawns. And we think, oh, it'll be the same as it was before when we go back to the office or to the workplace or to the shop. And we may say to ourselves, why did I put that job on one side and not tackle it before I left? Why didn't I face it? But I've got to go and face it now when I go back. That's life. That's life. And I think that's a degree of reality about the psalmist when he moves on to talk about toil and tears. Life is not all laughter. It's not all song. It's not all just enjoying the bright sunlight. So what does this psalm teach us about that other bit of life? So that here we are standing in the center, looking back to what God has done, yes, but able to look forward with confidence and with hope. What does it tell us about that? Well, it does say that Jesus promises us joy. That was very clear in our reading. That's one of the gifts that he brings. Paul listed it in the gift, fruit of the Spirit in Galatians. Jesus brings us joy. It's quite distinctive, it's quite characteristic, and it isn't in any way to be confused with the pleasures of this world. It is something deep and sustained. It's something real. It's something that changes and molds people's lives. Now, Paul listed it there, as I said. And interesting enough, when he was in prison, he wrote to his friends in Philippi, and what did he say to them? Oh, I'm in prison. He said, no, rejoice. Again, I say, rejoice. And it is a letter, very thankful of their friendship, but it has, that kind of thing. So amidst toil and tears, amidst all that we wish didn't happen but does happen, there is that joy that Jesus gives. Now, we come to 3 clues how that may be ours. And the first is this. Christian joy is nurtured by anticipation. And what I mean by that, it is nurtured by all the previous experiences that we've had, by all the previous times when life has been hard and dark and we've learned about and discovered God's goodness. All that lays a kind of foundation from which in times of darkness and difficulty we can draw upon. So that when we're faced with those situations, we're not like people cast out into the sea without a life belt. We're like people who have a life belt, and that life belt consists on all that stuff, all that experience, all that awareness and discovery of God in our life. Someone has put it like this, that joy builds on the past and borrows for the future. And that's really a very, very good way of putting it. That's the first thing, the first clue. The other 2 clues are found here in the text of this psalm. And the first is this, that rain refreshes the desert. The psalmist talks about the Negev. Now, one of the features of the Negev in the dry season is that there are these little gullies, hardly valleys, little gullies, little dips that come down. And there's no water, they're arid, they're dry, and then the rain comes. And the rain runs down these. And what was completely desert and arid suddenly bursts into flower. It's one of the strange miracles. You wouldn't think that seeds would live on in that kind of environment, but they do. And suddenly the desert is transformed. Transformed. And that's so with us. Look, folks, there are times when our hearts are as dry and as desolate as the Negev. Times when the dryness seems really to get to us. And then suddenly there's an infusion of God's grace. And sometimes it comes unexpectedly as you meet a friend. Sometimes it comes perhaps as you open Scripture. Sometimes it comes as you go perhaps reluctantly to church. And then suddenly there's an infusion of God's grace. And what was once so barren and arid and lifeless suddenly bursts into life. Those are very important experiences, and we oughtn't to dismiss them when they come. They're very rich, and we ought to draw upon them. And then the second picture that's here in the psalm is this man going out to sow his seeds. Now, farming in those days was a lot more primitive to what it is today. And farmers didn't prepare their land in the way they do today. So he goes out on what we think is not very promising land, and he scatters his seed. The sun's beating. The bag of seeds are pretty heavy. And walking up and down, scattering his seed. And we think, wow, is there going to be any fruit, any comeback from that? And then autumn comes, and the man who went out feeling burdened in his work goes out to reap a harvest. And again, we need to remember that all our experiences of sadness as well as joy, our experiences of difficulties as well as ease, our experiences of trouble as well as pleasure, that if they're sown in God, if they're sown in His love, they will bring a harvest with all its joy and with all its delight. You can, of course, as many people do, push all that kind of stuff, the nasty kind of stuff I mean, they can push it all to one side and repress it and supposedly keep it clamped down. But they're only fooling themselves, because human experiences don't go away. And if you keep them clamped down like that, one day will come, sooner or later, when they'll have to be faced. So the best way to deal with them is to sow them in God. To say, yes, Lord, this has happened. Yes, Lord, there is a tragedy. Yes, Lord, I wouldn't have wished this on myself for £1,000. But when it happens, to take it to God and to share it with Him. So there we are. So, you and I stand at the center. Behind us, this long story of deliverance that for us becomes personal, the story of our salvation. Ahead of us, our lives. And even in the summer, well, we're not quite sure. We live in a world that is hell-bent on pleasure. It's hell-bent on pleasure by depersonalizing relationships. It's hell-bent on pleasure by using its money. It's hell-bent on pleasure by wanting to go from one experience to another. It is hell-bent on pleasure. The advertisements on the television, the portrayal that is given in normal life, we live in that world. And in doing all that, they miss the one thing they'll make for joy. They miss the one thing that can be life-transforming. Because all that search is self-centered. All that search is feeding their own ego. And it's taking out of account that other dimension to life, where God comes in. Sometimes when I'm doing evangelism Or in other situations, people say to me, "Oh, I'm not religious." To which I say, "Amen, I'm glad to hear that, but you are spiritual." And that's the point, that every one of us have that other dimension. And unless the spiritual dimension is addressed, we're not going to get anywhere. You see, I'm talking about a joy that's not dependent upon banishing sadness. I'm talking about a joy that's dependent upon knowing God's love. I'm talking about something that emerges from a relationship. I'm talking about something that the Lord has made possible for every one of us. Knowing Him. Knowing Him. So it isn't something very, very rare and esoteric. It's something for us all, that we can all know Him. And laughter results in living in the midst of God's grace. It's like living in the midst of His goodness. God's goodness isn't exhausted. God's providence hasn't suddenly ceased. His love hasn't been withdrawn. And we just need to live in the midst of that, in the midst of it every day. From the moment we wake, "This is the day the Lord has made, let us rejoice and be glad in it," to when we go to sleep, "Watch over us, Lord, this night." So let me end by saying very simply that there's no formula for joy. There's no formula for knowing this ongoing love of God. All that we can do is to remember, on the one hand, those great acts of God that we celebrate in our services, and on the other hand, to trust in the promises of God and to let them be the two boundaries down which we walk, the road between that. So that both individually and collectively as a church, we become people committed to a discipleship that isn't something rarefied and out of this world, but a discipleship that's firmly rooted in what we do day by day, so that we can declare how good is our God. And we come back at the end to that all-important verse: "The Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy." Amen. We're going to sing to close the hymn, "Blessed Be Thy Name." And just look how this brings the good things and the bad things together. Thank you.